instead of blaming the violence on zealous nationalism, which seems pretty obvious to me, Marty blames it on, this is the kind of trouble that religion can cause in public. And so to me, the whole idea that there is this kind of thing called religion, which is especially dangerous and violent, the real question we need to be asking is, what purpose does this myth serve? And it basically serves to legitimate, civil political authorities, legitimate nationalism, for example, and delegitimate the participation in public of Jews, Christians, Muslims, etc. So it has these kind of domestic purposes. The myth also has foreign purposes in foreign policy, most of which are directed against Muslims these days.
So now you're speaking a bit about the purpose that this myth serves.
Mm-hmm.
And if I understand correctly, your first point, right, is that this myth of or I would even say the casting of religion as dangerous, right, serves to bolster faith in the secular or nationalist state.
Right. Yeah. So, for example, you can look at a book by Sam Harris. He's one of the kind of famous so-called new atheists.
Right.
His book, The End of Faith, is a kind of wholesale attack on religion. It won the Penn Award for nonfiction in 2005. It's been endorsed by Alan Dershowitz and Richard Dawkins and Peter Singer and so on. So an influential book. And in it, he argues, for example, that you can torture terrorists. But so he provides one argument about the kind of irrational religious torturing of witches. But later on in the book, you find him justifying torturing terrorists. He talks about Islam. He's got this chapter on Islam, which basically says there's no use talking to them because they're so irrational. They believe all of these crazy things. And he says that when there's no use talking to somebody, the only means we can use is violence. You basically have to, he talks about, we have to invade, impose democratic regimes on them with a kind of benevolent dictatorship, and then hope that they get reasonable eventually. So, and the logic is impeccable, and from that point of view, right? People who are religious are so irrational; they believe these crazy things about invisible gods. There's no use dealing with them, trying to reason with them, and so you can only use violence. And so the book becomes a kind of intellectual justification of the Iraq War and other things like that. Christopher Hitchens was a huge proponent of the Iraq War for the same sorts of reasons, right? So it becomes a kind of species of secularist ideology that can be just as violent as any other kind of violence.
So what about that point though, that in what you just said, I would take issue with saying, look, torturing a terrorist, right, versus torturing a witch, right? I'm sympathetic with maintaining that there's a difference between those two things.
I'm not. I mean, I think torture is one of those things that is always wrong, no matter what the circumstances are. My religious tradition says it's one of those things that's always wrong, regardless of the circumstances. And part of the problem, of course, is that torture doesn't work anything like the way people think it works. My first book is on torture. It's called Torture and Eucharist, and it's about the use of torture under the Pinochet regime in Chile, where I lived during the Pinochet regime. And people think that you're always about to, discover the ticking time bomb by torturing the terrorist, and it never actually works that way. It's mostly used to instill fear and anxiety into the population. by terrorizing people. It is itself a kind of form of terrorism.
Uh-huh. But what about people that let's say that, and maybe this goes back to what we were talking about before, people who would say that, well, there's such a thing as being rational, right? And there's such a thing as religion, and they see that as the basic dichotomy, that somehow the violence perpetrated by a secular state is rational, and the violence perpetrated by religious groups is irrational.
Yeah, I just think that's wrong, right? I just think that's a ridiculous stereotype, and it's extraordinarily prejudicial against the 80 or 90% of the world's population that believes in God, right? I think that my tradition is eminently rational, not according to I mean, if you shrink the definition of rationality down to empirical rationality, then it's rational in a different sense. But I see no reason why you should have to shrink the definition of rationality down that way. I mean, this whole myth of religious violence is part of this way of dividing the world into us and them, right? We're rational, and those people over there are crazy, so we need to bomb them into the higher rationality. And I just don't think it works that way. I think if we're going to have peace, we need to stop trying to divide people into, us rational people and you crazy people, and instead just say, look, it's not a matter of believers and non-believers. Everybody believes in something. So you tell me what you believe, I'll tell you what I believe, and we'll have a conversation. But it's not like I have beliefs and you have only facts, and I'm I'm a little crazy or irrational or something like that.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and I want to get more into that. But before we leave behind completely the meat and potatoes of your argument, can you give a few more examples of conflicts that are traditionally seen as religious, right? Which may at their root not be.
Well, again, see, I want to avoid saying that some things are religious and some things aren't, right? I mean, part of the question is when, what things get labeled religion and what things don't, right? So,
right.
To me, it's not a matter of nailing it. I'm not trying to defend religion, because I don't know what religion is, right? I think everybody has these kinds of beliefs. There are secular beliefs. There are, there's nationalism, there's Islam, there's Marxism. People kill for all kinds of things. And so the real question is not religious violence versus secular violence. The real question is violence, right? What can we do to mitigate violence? And the kind of dividing things up into religious violence and secular violence, I think is supremely unhelpful. People kill for all sorts of things.
So what approach do you think would be more helpful?
To be as empirical as you possibly can, right? To get down to, so for example, instead of saying, debating the question of, does religion cause violence or not? Which is to me just a nonsensical sort of question, or saying, is Islam violent or is it not? Instead, you get down to the nitty-gritty and you say, okay, let's take a look at this particular strand of Wahhabist Islam that comes out of 18th century Saudi Arabia. And let's follow that and see under what circumstances does that contribute to violence or does it not contribute to violence, right? You get it as close to the ground as you possibly can, and see what are the kind of causes. And then you also are looking at material causes at the same time. So if you look at all of the stuff that's been written on Iran since 1979, the Islamic Revolution, this question of Shia Islam, right? Is it violent or is it not violent? Well, let's take a look at the Shah's reign from 1953. The Shah's installed in a coup supported by the United States and Great Britain. He then installs a secularist regime for 26 years that kills and tortures thousands of people through the Savak, his secret police. That is the background for the Islamic Revolution that happens in 1979. But we never talk about that. We just think that all of a sudden we wake up in 1979 and there's all these crazy Muslims that have had this religious experience, instead of looking at the actual circumstances of what has been going on in Iran, and the question of Western colonialism and all of those other kinds of things. So the whole situation in the Middle East needs to be understood against the backdrop of colonialism and questions like that. And then we can begin talking about different strands of Islam and under what circumstances they cause violence.
So this is an interesting thing, because I think what you're pointing out is somebody could look at you and see assume a professor of Catholic studies, he's a religious man, and the basis of some of the things that you've said tonight, and they could look at me with my little hat on, and they could say he's a religious guy. So these guys, these chummy guys, are getting together and they're talking about how wrong everybody is about religion. But you're making a point that I think is a really important one. So I want to see if I understand it correctly, that dividing the world into secular and religious, if we could even attempt to define it, which is not a simple prospect, as you mentioned, but dividing the world into that thing obscures our ability to actually get to the bottom of what really does cause violence and unnecessary violence.
Right, exactly. And in fact, in some circumstances, it can be used as a justification for violence, right? We need to impose a secular government on Iraq in order to create peace, and because you can't let religious people be in charge, and so on. So this whole distinction between religious and secular then becomes an actual reason for violence.
So our producer just showed me a comment that came up on YouTube. Man is always killed for any excuse, right? They just need a good boogeyman.
Yep. Yeah. So that's exactly right. Right.
So obviously as you stated clearly, the intent of your book is to sort of try to reframe the discussion of religious versus secular violence, and to say that violence really has other causes and other origins. Do you have feelings about where you feel the root of unnecessary violence really does come from?
Yeah, that's something that I've only begun to kind of dabble in some ways. I mean, there are all kinds of psychological theories of the origins of violence in, the kind of insecurity that comes from, difficult upbringings and those sorts of things. And I think a lot of that is really interesting. One of the most interesting things, of course, is just the simple observation that most violence is done by men, right? I mean, there's a whole
now we found the culprit,
right? I mean, all throughout history, just 95% of the violence has been done by men. So if you want to talk about probably rather than religious and secular, looking at the men-women divide would be much more fruitful.
Right. That's the next program.
Yeah. But there are some interesting theories. René Girard, the French theorist who just died a few years ago, has a really interesting theory, a social theory of violence, where he explains it as kind of people have desires that are mimetic. People desire what other people desire, just like, two kids fighting over a toy in a nursery. One kid is not interested in the toy until another kid starts playing with it, and then becomes this rivalry. He thinks this kind of on a social level, that's the way rivalries start. And in order to keep a society from blowing apart from these rivalries, the rivals kind of create peace by ganging up on a scapegoat and scapegoating, right? And so, poor whites and rich whites gang up on poor blacks in the antebellum South. The Jews become scapegoats in Nazi Germany and elsewhere, and so on. This whole kind of theory of creating social harmony by ganging up on a scapegoat, that to me has a lot of plausibility. I don't know if it explains everything like some Girardians do, but it's a pretty interesting theory.
Right. Okay, well, it's been a fascinating talk. I just, are there any points that you feel are very important that you feel like we haven't touched on?
One quote comes to me, and I think I'm gonna use it for the beginning of my book on idolatry, which is a sequel, as I said, to Myth of Religious Violence. But it's that famous quote from the Kenyon College commencement speech by David Foster Wallace, the novelist David Foster Wallace, from 2005. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's this remarkable commencement speech he gave at Kenyon College. And one of the things he says in it, he says, look, in the actual everyday trenches of life, there's no such thing as atheists. Everybody worships. The only question that we have and the only choice we get to make is what to worship. And he says the only reason for worshiping God or something like that is that anything else that you worship will eat you alive. He says if you worship your looks, you'll never feel beautiful enough. If you worship money, you'll never have enough. If you worship ambition, it's going to eat you up, and so on. And that to me really strikes me as absolutely true, and kind of at the heart of what I'm trying to say, is that everybody worships. The only question is, what are you going to worship, and what are you going to do because of that?
I think also that even even the word God, we have to drill down in that word also, because depending on how people define that, if they worship that, it can also be it can also have negative consequences.
Oh, absolutely, right? Yeah.
So I think that what again this is the real thrust of your book, and what I'm getting from the argument is that we need to start asking more sophisticated questions about what we really worship and what we really believe in, and not be satisfied with the words religious and secular, but to get more specific than that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, and what you said is absolutely right. I mean, it applies. Idolatry critique is primarily self-critique, should be primarily self-critique. It's right. What am I doing wrong, right? So idolatry can be worshiping the wrong God, but it can also be worshiping the right God wrongly, right? Which is probably what most of us are doing most of the time.
Awesome. Okay, so on that note, hopefully, especially now in these turbulent times, we'll get beyond big words like secular and religious. We'll all be more transparent and honest about what we really believe and what we really want, and learn how to come together better. And thank you so much for a wonderful and stimulating discussion and book. Thank you for tackling this topic, and it's quite a thing to take on the entire foundation of Western culture. of the modern state in Western culture. I try to dismantle that in a short book. But thank you, and more strength to you.
Thank you, Sedge. This has been delightful.
Okay, it was a great pleasure. Good night, and good night, everybody. Thank you for joining Thursday Night Live.